For 478 days, they did not lose. Not to the best tag team, not to the fan favorites, not to the legends. For nearly a year and a half, two men in black leather and war paint held the most important tag team prize in the wrestling world, and nobody could take it from them. They set a record that would stand for 28 years. And then, almost overnight, they vanished. Not gracefully, not with a farewell tour or a retirement speech or a torch passing moment in the middle of a sold out arena. They just faded. One of them got sick, another walked away, a third disappeared into a completely different character, and within a year of holding that record of being one of the biggest acts in the entire company, they were gone, broken up, repackaged, forgotten by the very promotion that had built them into monsters. Today, most casual wrestling fans couldn't tell you their names. They remember the Road Warriors, they remember the Hart Foundation, they remember the British Bulldogs, but the team that held the belts longer than any of them, the team that steamrolled the entire division for 3 straight years, they're completely forgotten. This is the story of Demolition, how they went from the most feared tag team on the planet to a name that time nearly erased completely. And by the time we're done, you'll understand something that took the wrestling world decades to admit, that the reason they were forgotten had almost nothing to do with how good they were, and almost everything to do with the shadow of 2 other men they could never quite escape. In this video, we're going to trace the entire rise and fall, the origin nobody talks about, the record-setting reign, the single decision that killed their momentum, the health crisis that changed everything, and the strange, quiet aftermath where 2 of the 3 men involved would end up in prison, in obscurity, and in an early grave. But to understand how far they fell, you first have to understand how high they climbed. And that story begins not with a moment of triumph, but with a problem sitting in the office of the most powerful man in wrestling. It was the mid-1980s, and the World Wrestling Federation was becoming a machine. Vince McMahon had taken his father's regional promotion and turned it into a national juggernaut. Hulk Hogan was the biggest star in the business. The product was expanding onto television screens all across America, and Vince was watching everything, taking notes, figuring out what worked and what he needed, and what he wanted badly was a tag team like the Road Warriors. If you don't know the Road Warriors, understand this. Hawk and Animal were the most electrifying tag team in the world at that moment. 2 enormous face-painted powerhouses in spiked leather who didn't so much wrestle their opponents as demolish them. They came out to heavy metal, they threw grown men around like toys, and crowds went absolutely insane for them. They were a phenomenon, and they were working for Vince's competition in the National Wrestling Alliance in the territories run by Jim Crockett. Vince wanted that lightning in a bottle for himself. The story that has followed Demolition for their entire existence is that Vince tried to sign the Road Warriors, couldn't get them, and decided that if he couldn't have the real thing, he would build his own. Whether that's exactly how it happened or a legend that grew in the telling, the end result was the same. The World Wrestling Federation was going to create a face-painted, leather-clad, power-brawling tag team of its own, and they had just the veteran in mind to lead it. His name was Bill Eadie, and by the mid-80s, Bill Eadie had already lived an entire wrestling life before most fans ever saw his face, because for years, they hadn't seen his face at all. Eadie had been a high school teacher and coach in Ohio, a legitimate athlete with real amateur credentials, standing 6'3" and weighing close to 290 pounds. He got pulled into professional wrestling in the early 70s, breaking in through the Detroit territory, and he found his greatest early fame behind a mask, working as a character called the Masked Superstar. Under that hood, he became one of the most respected big men in the entire country. He wrestled all over the territories, he held championships. He was one of the first men to ever body slam André the Giant. He challenged Bob Backlund. He crossed paths with a young, rising Hulk Hogan. This was not some rookie. This was a seasoned professional with more than a decade of experience and the trust of everyone he worked with. So when the World Wrestling Federation needed someone to anchor their new creation, someone who could carry a gimmick, protect his opponents, and lead a green partner, Eadie was the obvious choice. He took off the mask, he painted his face, and he became Axe. Think about what that actually meant for a man like him. Eadie had spent a decade and a half building a reputation as one of the most respected big men in the entire industry. A wrestler other wrestlers looked up to, a legitimate athlete who'd earned everything the hard way, and now he was being asked to put on a costume that was, by its own design, an imitation of somebody else, a manufactured act, a knockoff of a team working 3 states away. A lesser man might have seen that as an insult, a step down, a role beneath his talent. Eadie saw it as an opportunity because he understood something a lot of wrestlers never figure out. It doesn't matter where a character comes from, it only matters what you do with it once it's yours. And Eadie was determined to take this borrowed idea and make it into something nobody could dismiss. Now he needed a partner. And this is where the story gets a little messy, because the man who was originally supposed to be the other half of Demolition and was not the man who made it famous. The original Smash was a wrestler named Randy Colley, and on paper, it made sense. Colley was a big, capable hand, and he and Eadie actually came up with the concept together. The two of them debuted the Demolition gimmick on January 4th, 1987, at a house show in Springfield, Massachusetts, defeating the Islanders. They came to the ring in studded black leather and leather-covered hockey masks, which they would peel off to reveal the war paint underneath. Managed at first by a slick character named Luscious Johnny Valiant, they looked the part. They had the menace. It should have worked. There was just one enormous problem. The fans recognized Randy Colley because before he was Smash, Colley had spent time in the World Wrestling Federation as a character called Moondog Rex, one half of a wild savage tag team called the Moondogs. And World Wrestling Federation fans had good memories. Every time the new masked Smash came to the ring, fans in the crowd would start chanting the old name at him, Moondog, Moondog. They saw right through the paint. And a monster you're chanting the wrong name at is not a monster at all. It's a joke. The whole aura of the gimmick, the mystery, the fear, all of it evaporated the second the crowd figured out who was underneath. Eadie knew it wasn't going to work. He said as much. The character was being killed before it ever got off the ground. So after only a handful of matches, a decision was made. Colley was out, and the World Wrestling Federation needed a new Smash fast. Someone the fans wouldn't recognize. They found him working for the competition, a journeyman named Barry Darsow. Darsow was born in Minneapolis, trained by the legendary Eddie Sharkey in a class that also produced Rick Rude, and in one of the great ironies of this entire story, the Road Warriors themselves. He'd bounced around the territories for years, and he'd found his biggest success down in the National Wrestling Alliance, playing a Soviet sympathizer called Crusher Khrushchev, running with the Russian villains Ivan and Nikita Koloff. He was solid, he was tough, he was a genuine mid-card hand who'd held championships and knew how to work. But most importantly, World Wrestling Federation fans had no idea who he was. There was a real divide in wrestling back then. You were either an NWA fan or a World Wrestling Federation fan, and the two audiences barely overlapped. Darsow had done his best work in a completely different world in front of completely different crowds. To the World Wrestling Federation audience, he was a blank slate. So when he left the NWA after a pay dispute with Jim Crockett and stepped into the role of Smash, aired for the first time in February of 1987, nobody in the crowd chanted anything at him. Nobody recognized him. He was just a terrifying man in war paint. And that finally was the version of Demolition that would change everything. Axe and Smash, Bill Eadie and Barry Darsow, two big, mean, methodical brawlers who looked like they'd driven straight out of a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and the moment they clicked, they became one of the most destructive forces the tag team division had ever seen. But their real reign of terror was only just beginning, and to reach the top, they'd have to run through everyone. The rise was almost frighteningly fast. Demolition didn't ease into the division, they tore through it. Team after team was thrown in front of them, and team after team got flattened. The Killer Bees, the Rougeau brothers, the British Bulldogs, who were among the best pure wrestlers in the entire company, the Young Stallions. It didn't matter how good you were or how popular you were. When Demolition came for you, you got demolished. Part of what made them work was how different they actually were from the team they'd been built to imitate. The Road Warriors were explosive. Their matches were often short, violent bursts over almost as fast as they started, all raw power and spectacle. Demolition was something colder, something slower, and more menacing. They ground their opponents down, stomps, clotheslines, heavy, deliberate punishment that made every match feel like a beating that would never end. Axe was the grizzled veteran who could work a crowd and control a match. Smash was the raw muscle. Together they had a rhythm that most imitation acts never find. They weren't just a costume, they were a genuinely great team, and their look sold it completely. The black leather, the studs, smaller and sharper than the Warriors, giving them their own identity. The war paint, usually black and white and red and silver, sometimes shifting into other colors. They came out to a pounding, ominous theme that told you, before the bell even rang, that something bad was about to happen to two men in the ring. You have to understand just how stacked that division was to appreciate what Demolition were doing. This was not a weak era for tag team wrestling. This was arguably the deepest the company's tag division has ever been before or since. There were teams full of world-class technicians, teams built on high-flying speed, teams anchored by future Hall of Famers, all of them fighting for the same shot at the top. And Demolition didn't just survive in that environment, they dominated it. They walked into the most competitive tag scene in the world and made it look like their personal playground. Every night a new challenger, every night the same result. Two men in war paint standing tall while their opponents got carried out. Their undefeated streak finally ended in June of 1987 against a popular team called the Can-Am Connection. But a single loss didn't slow the momentum at all. If anything, it made them meaner, and around this time, they got the final piece of the puzzle. Their manager, Johnny Valiant, moved on, and their contracts were handed over to a cackling, cane-wielding master of villainy named Mr. Fuji. Fuji was perfect for them. A devious, cheating, endlessly entertaining heel manager who would do anything to help his men win, from distracting the referee to cracking opponents over the head with his cane when nobody was looking. He even started wearing war paint around his own eyes to match his team. With Fuji in their corner, Demolition became not just powerful, but protected. Every match now carried the threat that if their opponent somehow found an advantage, Fuji would erase it with one swing of that cane. All of it was building toward one night. The biggest night of the year, the grandest stage the company had, WrestleMania 4, March 27th, 1988, Atlantic City. And the tag team champions at the time were Strikeforce, a beloved duo of Rick Martel and Tito Santana. Martel was one half of that Can-Am Connection that had handed Demolition their first loss almost a year earlier. So there was history here, a score to settle, and Demolition settled it in the most Demolition way imaginable. Deep in the match, Martel had Smash locked in his submission finisher, the Boston Crab. The referee was watching the hold, and that was exactly the mistake Fuji had been waiting for. Axe grabbed Fuji's cane, cracked Martel across the head while the official's back was turned, and Smash rolled over and covered him. The referee counted 3, and just like that, Demolition were the World Tag Team Champions. They had reached the mountaintop, but here's the thing about Demolition that almost nobody predicted. Winning those titles wasn't the peak of their story, it was the start of the greatest tag team title reign the company had ever seen. And the strangest twist of all was still coming. Because the most feared villains in the division were about to become the most beloved heroes in it. And it happened almost by accident. For the first stretch of their reign, Demolition were monsters. Hated, dominant, protected by Fuji, doing everything the wrong way and getting away with all of it. But something was happening in the arenas that the company couldn't ignore. The fans were starting to cheer them anyway. It's one of the oldest phenomena in wrestling. Sometimes an act is just so cool, so tough, so undeniably compelling that no matter how villainous you make them, the crowd falls in love. That's what was happening with Demolition. People wanted to see them destroy their opponents, the war paint, the entrance, the sheer brutality of it. All of it was too much fun to boo. So the company leaned into it, and they did it with one of the great double turns in wrestling history. In the summer of 1988, a powerful new team was brought in to challenge Demolition, the Powers of Pain, two enormous face-painted powerhouses of their own, the Warlord and the Barbarian, brought in as heroic monsters to finally stop the champions. The two teams feuded across the country, and it all came to a head at the very first SummerSlam, and then boiled over at Survivor Series that November. At Survivor Series, in the middle of the chaos, Mr. Fuji turned his back on the team he'd guided to the top. He abandoned Demolition, he sided with the powers of pain, and in doing so, he flipped the entire dynamic on its head. Suddenly, the crowd's beloved monsters had been betrayed by their own devious manager. Demolition were now the wronged party, the tough guys stabbed in the back, and the fans who'd already wanted to cheer them now had every reason to. The powers of pain, the team that had been brought in as heroes, became the villains. It was a clean, total swap. Demolition were now heroes, and they were more popular than ever. The feud culminated at WrestleMania 5 in April of 1989 in a handicap match where Demolition faced both the Powers of Pain and the traitor Fuji, two men and their turncoat manager, against the champions. And Demolition won, catching Fuji with their devastating finisher to retain the gold. That finisher, by the way, was a thing of beauty and terror. They called it the Demolition Decapitation. One man would hoist an opponent up across his shoulders in a backbreaker. The other would climb to the top rope and come crashing down with a flying elbow or clothesline onto the trapped, helpless victim. It looked like it could end a career. And once they hit it, the match was almost always over. But WrestleMania 5 wasn't just another title defense, it was a milestone, because on that very night, Demolition officially became the longest reigning World Tag Team Champions in the entire history of the company. They broke a record that had stood for years, held by the Valiant brothers, who'd reigned for 370 days. Demolition blew past it, and they kept going. By the time it was all over, their first reign as champions had lasted 478 days. Sit with that number for a second. In an era with one of the deepest, most competitive tag team divisions the business has ever seen, with legendary teams stacked on top of each other, all fighting for the same prize, Demolition held those belts for nearly a year and a half without letting go. They defended against everyone. The Hart Foundation, the British Bulldogs, the best teams the company could throw at them night after night, city after city, and they turned all of them away. That record would not be broken for 28 years. It would stand until 2016, when a trio called the New Day finally surpassed it. And even then, in terms of the classic version of that championship that existed from 1971 all the way to 2010, Demolition's single reign remains the longest anyone ever held it. Nobody in nearly 4 decades ever matched what Axe and Smash did in that one stretch. They were, at that moment, arguably the most popular tag team in the entire company. Adored by kids, feared by opponents, moving merchandise, headlining house shows. There were Demolition posters and Demolition t-shirts and Demolition action figures. There was even, and this is real, Demolition peanut butter. They had crossed over from a wrestling act into a genuine pop culture brand. This was the top of the mountain. This was as high as it would ever get. And the terrible truth is that from up here, there was nowhere to go but down. The first crack in the empire was about to appear, and it would come from a legend riding to the ring on the back of a much bigger legend. Every reign ends, and Demolitions finally did in the summer of 1989 when they ran into two of the most cunning veterans in the entire sport, the Brainbusters, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. These weren't power monsters, they were technicians and ring generals, two of the smartest, most polished workers alive, and they'd come over from the NWA to challenge the World Wrestling Federation's best. They caught Demolition in a 2 out of 3 falls match on Saturday night's main event, and they had help, because at ringside, lending his enormous presence to the challengers, was André the Giant. With André's interference tipping the scales, the Brainbusters did what no team had managed for 478 days. They beat Demolition and took the titles. But this is the part that tells you how strong Demolition still were. Losing the belts didn't end them, it barely slowed them down. Just a couple of months later, in October of 1989, they got the titles right back, capturing the gold for a second time. The Empire was wounded, but it was still standing. Their second reign was shorter, and it ran into a familiar wall. In December of 1989, they lost the championships to a team called the Colossal Connection. Oh, and what a team it was. The Colossal Connection was André the Giant himself, paired with a genuinely terrifying powerhouse named Haku, and the two of them were guided by the smartest manager in the business, Bobby the Brain Heenan. Losing to André and Haku set up one more enormous stage for Demolition, one more shot at glory, one more WrestleMania, WrestleMania 6, April 1st, 1990. Demolition challenged the Colossal Connection for the titles, and this was a chance to make history all over again, because a win here would make them 3-time champions, one of the very first teams in the company's history to reach that mark. The match had drama, it had size, it had legends, and when it was over, Demolition stood tall. They'd overcome André and Haku. They'd captured their 3rd World Tag Team Championship. The crowd roared for them, they were on top again. But there was something happening in that match that almost nobody in the building understood at the time. Something that, in hindsight, marks the exact moment one era ended and another began. WrestleMania 6 was the last time André the Giant ever wrestled a televised match on American soil. The Giant was breaking down. His body, which had carried him to a level of fame no wrestler had ever known, was failing him. That night in Toronto, the men of Demolition later said they could tell he wasn't feeling well, though they didn't know it would be his last American appearance. André trusted them. They had a good match with him because he liked them, and anyone who knew André knew that if he didn't like you, nothing good was going to happen in that ring. It was, without anyone quite realizing it, a passing of the torch. The old giant on his way out, and the champions he was handing the moment to on the verge of their own collapse. Because here's what almost nobody watching that celebration knew: one half of Demolition was sick, really sick, and the decision the company was about to make to deal with it would, more than anything else, be the thing that killed them. Bill Eadie's body was betraying him. By 1990, Axe was dealing with serious health problems. The exact nature of them has been described different ways over the years. Some accounts point to an illness he picked up on a tour of Japan, something that caused temporary heart issues. Others have referenced a severe reaction, possibly an allergy that laid him low. Whatever the precise medical cause, the effect was the same. Eadie was getting sick enough that retirement was on the table. He was a veteran, he'd been going hard for the better part of 2 decades, and his body was telling him it might be time to stop. The company had a champion who couldn't be relied on to make every date, and they had a hot act they didn't want to lose. So they came up with a solution. They would add a 3rd man. His name was Brian Adams, and he became Crush. Adams was a genuine specimen, a huge, powerful man from Kona, Hawaii, who had trained in Japan under the legendary Antonio Inoki. He was younger than Eadie and Darsow, physically imposing, and on paper he was a logical insurance policy. If Axe couldn't go, Crush could step in and the team could keep defending the titles without missing a beat. To make it all work within the rules, Demolition adopted what wrestling calls the Freebird rule, the idea that any 2 members of a 3-man group can defend the tag team titles on any given night. Named after the fabulous Freebirds who made the concept famous, it let Axe, Smash, and Crush rotate freely. On screen, they spun it as villainous cunning, 3 men to cheat with instead of 2. In reality, it was a medical accommodation for a sick veteran, and it fundamentally changed the chemistry of the act. Because Demolition worked as 2. Axe and Smash were a pair, a duo, a matched set of monsters that fans had spent 3 years learning to love. When you added a 3rd face, when you started rotating the members, when Axe began fading into the background and taking on more of a managerial role, while the younger Smash and Crush did the heavy lifting, something was lost. The team that had felt so tight, so inevitable, so complete, now felt diluted, watered down. Crush, for all his talent, never quite meshed with Smash the way Smash had meshed with Axe. The magic was thinning out, and that would have been a manageable problem. A team can survive a lineup change. What Demolition could not survive was what walked through the company's doors that same year. And the Road Warriors, the real ones, Hawk and Animal. The Team Demolition had been built to imitate 4 years earlier. After all that time in the NWA, they finally signed with the World Wrestling Federation, and they arrived under the name the Legion of Doom. And the moment they showed up, they exposed the one weakness Demolition could never fix. Because for 4 years, Demolition had gotten to be the biggest, meanest, most face-painted power team in their world. In the World Wrestling Federation, there was nothing else like them. The comparison to the Road Warriors existed, sure, but a huge chunk of the World Wrestling Federation audience had never even seen the Road Warriors. To those fans, Demolition weren't imitations. They were the originals, the one and only, and then the actual originals walked in, and suddenly, standing right next to each other, the whole illusion came apart. Now everyone could see it. Now the comparison wasn't a rumor from another promotion, it was live, on the same television show in the same building, and no matter how good Demolition were, no matter what records they held, they could never again be the only team of their kind. They were permanently and visibly the other guys, the copies, the ones who came second. Yeah, the company knew what it had. It knew the Legion of Doom were a bigger deal, a bigger draw, a bigger future, and once Hawk and Animal were on the roster, the World Wrestling Federation's interest in Axe and Smash began to quietly drain away. The fall wasn't going to be a dramatic defeat. It was going to be something much colder, a slow phasing out, and it started at SummerSlam. SummerSlam 1990, Demolition, now operating as a three-man unit, defended their titles against the Hart Foundation, Bret and Jim, in another 2 out of 3 falls match. And the finish told you everything about where Demolition now stood in the company's plans. The match was designed around their new gimmick, the 3-man shell game. Smash and Crush started the bout, but at some point, with the referee distracted, Axe secretly snuck down to ringside and swapped himself into the match, trying to use the extra body to steal the win the way villains do. It was clever. It was the whole point of having 3 men, and it got exposed in brutal, humiliating fashion because the Legion of Doom, the very team that had made Demolition obsolete, came marching down to the ring and blew the whole scheme wide open. They pointed out the deception, they snuffed out the trick, and in the chaos, the Hart Foundation captured the titles. Demolition's third and final reign was over. Crush took the fall. Think about the symbolism of that. The team that Demolition had been created to replace was now the team that personally ended their title reign, standing in the ring, exposing them as frauds in front of the whole audience. It was almost cruel, and it set up the feud everyone should have wanted. Demolition versus the Legion of Doom, the imitation against the original, 2 face-painted power teams finally colliding after 4 years of the wrestling world wondering what it would look like. On paper, it was a dream match. In reality, it was a disaster because it came years too late. By the time those matches actually happened, Demolition was a shell. Axe was sick and fading. Crush was still finding his footing. The team's momentum was gone, their aura punctured, and the Legion of Doom, fresh and hot and beloved, simply ran through them. The dream feud everyone had imagined turned into a series of one-sided beatings, with Hawk and Animal easily disposing of the team they'd made irrelevant. Even when the company added the World Wrestling Federation champion, the Ultimate Warrior, to the mix in 6-man matches, it only underlined the point. Demolition were now the guys getting beaten to make other stars look good. And this is the real tragedy of the whole thing. Imagine if that feud had happened 3 years earlier. Imagine 2 fresh, dominant, face-painted power teams at the absolute height of their abilities, colliding when both were unstoppable, when the whole wrestling world was buzzing about which one was better. That would have been one of the greatest tag team rivalries in the history of the business. It could have drawn money for a year. It could have produced classic matches people would still be talking about today. Instead, the wrestling gods gave it to fans too late when one team was already broken, and it landed with a thud, a dream that curdled into a formality, the right match at exactly the wrong time, and Demolition were the ones who paid for that timing with the last of their credibility. Axe faded further and further into the background. His health wasn't improving, and late in 1990, Bill Eadie left the company. The man who'd conceived the whole gimmick, who'd taken off the masked superstar's hood to become Axe, who'd led this team to a record that would stand for nearly 30 years, was simply gone, quietly, without ceremony. That left Smash and Crush, 2/3 of a team, missing the third that mattered most. They limped along for a few more months, and then came the final indignity. WrestleMania 7, March 1991. Smash and Crush went to the biggest show of the year, and they lost. Not in an epic battle, not in a hard-fought classic. They were beaten in a short, one-sided match by a pair of Japanese wrestlers, Genichiro Tenryu and Koji Kitao. It was quick, it was decisive, and it was clearly the end. Shortly after that, the company officially disbanded Demolition, the most dominant tag team of its era. The record holders, the peanut butter jar pop culture crossover act, were done. Not with a send-off, just switched off like a light in a room nobody was using anymore. And here's the part that stings the most: what came next for these three men. Because the way each of their stories continued tells you exactly how completely the wrestling world had decided to forget Demolition ever mattered. Start with Barry Darsow, Smash. One half of the greatest tag team reign the company had ever seen. He got repackaged into a comedy character, the Repo Man, an over-the-top, sneaking, cartoonish villain who dressed like a burglar and stole people's things. He crept around ringside, swiping objects. He hung opponents up with a tow rope, and he cut goofy, theatrical promos. And here's the detail that really drives home how thoroughly Demolition had been erased. The company never once acknowledged on television that the Repo Man was Smash. There was no story about a former champion falling on hard times, no callback to the 478 days. Nothing. It was as if Smash had simply never existed, and this new clown had appeared out of thin air. The Repo Man feuded with the British Bulldog and lost. He stole Randy Savage's hat and lost. He faded to the lower card and then out of the company entirely, and he'd go on to a string of other forgettable gimmicks. The Blacktop Bully, a golf-obsessed character called Mr. Hole-in-One, a record-setting champion reduced to a punchline. Then there was Bryan Adams, Crush, the youngest of the three, the one with the most future ahead of him, and his story is the most complicated and ultimately the saddest of them all. Adams actually did the best of the three in the short term. He left, spent a year back in the Pacific Northwest, and then returned to the World Wrestling Federation in 1992, completely reinvented. He was still called Crush, but now the war paint and leather were gone, replaced by a laid-back Hawaiian surfer character built around his real upbringing in Kona. He came out to island music, he wore bright colors, and for a while, this new Crush looked like he might actually become a breakout singles star. There was real potential there, but it never quite took off the way it should have. He got squashed and injured in a program with the massive Yokozuna. He turned heel, blaming his friend Randy Savage, and the two had a violent personal feud that led to a match at WrestleMania 10, which Crush lost. He cycled through gimmick after gimmick, an angry ex-convict, a biker in a menacing faction called the Disciples of Apocalypse, a member of the Nation of Domination, and the ex-convict gimmick cut close to real life because Adams actually did serve time, connected to gun smuggling charges in Hawaii, a fact so real the company even referenced it on television. He eventually jumped to the rival company WCW, ran with the famous NWO faction, got saddled with a bizarre character based on the rock band Kiss, and finally found some success in a hard-hitting team called Chronic. He kept working, kept grinding, kept trying to be more than the third man in a team that had been thrown away. And then on August 13th, 2007, Bryan Adams was found unconscious in his home in Tampa, Florida. His wife discovered him not breathing in his bed and called for help. Paramedics couldn't revive him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 43 years old, gone far too soon, like so many of the men from that brutal, punishing era of the business. And finally, there was Bill Eadie Axe, the architect of the whole thing. Eadie's story after Demolition is, in some ways, the one that hurts the most because of what it revealed about how the business treated the men who built it. After leaving, Eadie tried to keep the Demolition name alive himself out on the independent circuit. He brought back the original Smash, Randy Colley, and added another partner, trying to resurrect the gimmick he had created. And the company that had disbanded and forgotten him did not simply let him have it. They sent him a cease and desist letter. When he pushed further, when he actually filed a lawsuit in the mid-1990s to try to win the rights to the Demolition name and character he'd helped invent, he lost. Think about that. The man who conceived the concept, who led it to a record that would stand for 28 years, who gave the company one of its biggest acts of the late 80s, couldn't even use the name after they were done with him. He was locked out of his own creation. So there it is. That's how Demolition went from unstoppable to forgotten. Not because they weren't great, they were. Not because their record wasn't real. It stood for nearly 3 decades. But because the wrestling business is a machine that is always looking for the next thing, and the moment the real Road Warriors arrived, Demolition became yesterday's idea. A copy standing next to the original. And copies, no matter how good, no matter how successful, get quietly thrown away when the company decides it's done with them. They got sick, they got split up, they got repackaged into comedy characters that pretended they'd never been champions at all. One went to prison and then to an early grave. One got locked out of his own name. And an entire generation of newer fans grew up remembering the Road Warriors, the Hart Foundation, the Bulldogs, and never even hearing the name of the team that held the belts longer than any of them. For a long time, that seemed like the end of the story. A cautionary tale about being second, about building your whole identity on being someone else's answer, and then being discarded the moment the question changed. And Demolition became the ultimate what could have been a team whose real legacy lived only in the memories of the fans who were there and the record book that nobody bothered to read. But wrestling has a way of circling back, of remembering eventually the people it once tried to forget. Because in early 2026, decades after they'd been switched off and cast aside, the announcement finally came. Demolition, Axe and Smash, Bill Eadie, and Barry Darsow were going into the WWE Hall of Fame class of 2026. The recognition came from the very company that had once sent Eadie a cease and desist letter, that had refused to admit Smash and the Repo Man were the same man, that had let them fade without so much as a goodbye. All these years later, they finally got the induction their record demanded. It's a bittersweet ending because Bryan Adams isn't here to see any of it. Crush died nearly 2 decades before his team got its due, and you can't help but wonder what these 3 men could have been if the timing had been just a little different, if the Road Warriors had never come, if Bill Eadie's health had held, if the company had been willing to let 2 great copies become legends in their own right, instead of shoving them aside for the originals. And there's something worth sitting with in that Hall of Fame moment, beyond just the recognition itself. For years, Demolition existed in a strange kind of limbo. They were too successful to be truly obscure, and too overshadowed to be truly celebrated. Fans who lived through their run knew exactly how big they were. But the official history, the version the company chose to tell about itself, kept them at arm's length. They weren't in the highlight reels, they weren't in the tribute videos. When new fans learned about the great tag teams of the 80s, Demolition's name kept getting left off the list, as if their record was an embarrassment to be quietly ignored rather than a milestone to be honored. The induction didn't just reward them, it corrected the record. It forced the story to finally include the team it had spent decades trying to skip past. And for the men who lived it, and for the fans who never stopped insisting Axe and Smash mattered, that correction was a long time coming. But maybe that's the real lesson of Demolition. That greatness and memory are 2 different things. That you can be the best in the world at what you do, hold a record for 28 years, cross over into peanut butter jars and action figures and the imaginations of millions of kids, and still get forgotten if you're standing in the wrong shadow at the wrong time. And that sometimes, if you're lucky, if you live long enough, if the people who were there keep telling the story, the forgetting doesn't have to be forever. Axe and Smash steamrolled into the business from parts unknown, and they made it painfully clear they were going to demolish anything that stood in their path. For a few incredible years, they did exactly that. They just never got to demolish the one thing that beat them in the end, time, and the long shadow of 2 men in spiked leather who got there first. They weren't a copy, they were champions. They held the gold longer than anyone who ever came before them, and longer than almost anyone who came after. And it only took the world about 35 years, one lawsuit, one early grave, and a whole lot of forgetting to finally admit it. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the rise and fall of one of wrestling's most underrated teams, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the golden age of the squared circle. Until next time.